Hello everybody, hope you're doing well and thanks for joining us for another video. There are many people these days who don't believe NASA landed on the moon in the 1960s, and many people consider the father of this conspiracy to be a gentleman by the name of Bill Kaysing. Bill published a book about this in 1976 called We Didn't Go to the Moon, America's $30 billion Swindle. And Bill had previously worked as a technical writer at Rocketdyne, the company who developed 3 of the 5 types of rocket engines used on the Saturn V. Back in December, I published this video covering the rather ridiculous debate between Apollo astronaut Charlie Duke and prominent moon landing denier Bart Sibrel that was hosted on the Danny Jones podcast. And within my coverage of this, I made reference to a video clip from an interview that Bart did with Bill Kaysing. However, I didn't show the video clip due to potential copyright issues. Here's my video where I explain why. At this point, I was going to play the video that I've got of Bill Kaysing saying what Bill Kaysing says. However, that video originally came from a channel called Deadpool 69 Special. And I went onto his channel whilst I was editing just to get a little screenshot of the video title and the details, and the video's no longer there. So I messaged Deadpool and asked if he'd deleted the video, and he responded saying he'd not. Instead, it's now been reported for copyright by Bart Sibrel. Now, I had the clip in question from Deadpool, however, the clip was then hit with a copyright strike on their channel, so I was reluctant to include it in my video. Though, Deadpool has since re-uploaded the clip to his channel with a note in the description stating, quote, "For Jarrah White, you don't own this clip, you are not authorized to talk on behalf of Bart Sibrel, you have no notarized document proving you own a share of this clip. The clip is for educational purposes and to tell the truth about the moon landing hoax theories," end quote. So it seems the copyright claim didn't come directly from Bart, but instead from Jarrah White, who I have actually spoken with previously about the moon landings. Apparently, Jarrah was given permission by Bart to act on his behalf with regards to copyright claims and such. Now, before anyone tries piling on him about this, Jarrah was actually courteous enough to comment on my video in relation to that copyright and give his side of the story. He states, quote, "It was taken down because the YouTuber was quoting Kaysing's statements out of context to push a false narrative. Such deceptive misuse of copyrighted content is not protected under fair use," end quote. Jarrah then continues on to say, quote, "Allow me to clarify. Kaysing clearly states in his book that he did not watch the Apollo 11 telecast when it aired because he harbored doubts about the program, based on all the stuff he saw going on at Rocketdyne during his career. For the most part, he put said doubts out of his mind and didn't think twice about them. Now, Kaysing was the kind of man who would bring homeless people off the street and give them food and accommodation on his large houseboat until they could get back on their feet. One of them was John Grant, a Vietnam War veteran whose guilt over killing innocent Vietnamese people had driven him to heroin. During one of their discussions, Grant told Kaysing, 'Bill, I was conned into thinking that what I did was patriotic, but that you're a writer, why don't you blow a whistle on this rotten and corrupt government? Say something outrageous like we never went to the moon.' I must emphasize that Grant was suggesting Kaysing do a satirical project, something to spoof the government a la Dr. Strangelove. But Kaysing ultimately decided to do a serious investigative non-fiction work after learning about the death of Thomas Ronald Barron and his missing 500-page report," end quote. Well, after I published that original video of mine, I actually came upon the full hour-long interview on a channel called Press Rude, which was uploaded in May 2019. So it's been online for almost 7 years, as a mirror of Bart's original interview with Bill. Now, I've not sat through the entire interview, but I have skimmed over bits of it, and it seems to mainly be discussing the arguments that he lays out in his book. I will leave a link to the full interview in the description so that you can watch it all if you want. Well, unless that gets removed for copyright. But I was interested to find the full context of how Bill's book came to pass.
All he heard was sort of a roar coming from the Simi Hills and a lot of smoke coming up, but that's all he knew.
And What gave you that idea?
Well, after I quit Rocketdyne, I became a freelance writer. I got a book contract, and needing a good place to live, my wife and I bought a 75-foot Coast Guard cutter, which had been converted to living aboard.
So you can't hear Bart's entire question. I could only make out the part of him saying, "So what gave you?" and then the rest garbled. But I think it's safe to assume the question is along the lines of what gave you the idea to write the book. Bill goes on to talk about having a large boat and getting some of the nearby homeless population to come and stay on it, as Jarrah mentions in his comment. Bill then gets on to talking about John Grant.
So one of the men was a Vietnam veteran with a heroin habit. His name was John Grant. And he said, "Bill, the government really screwed me. They taught me how to kill. They sent me to Vietnam. I killed a lot of innocent people." He says, "I'm very bitter at this corrupt government." He said, "You're a writer. Why don't you write something outrageous like, say, we never went to the moon?" And that's exactly where I got the idea, from John Grant in 1974 at the Oakland Marina.
Now, this is where the clip from Deadpool ends, saying that he got the idea to write the book from John Grant, making this remark, and then Jarrah's argument against this is the clip is being taken out of context. And in fairness, Bart's next question to Bill is asking him when he then became suspicious about the moon landings.
Prior to that time, I, like almost everybody else in the United States, believed that we went to the moon.
What gave you the first suspicion that the flights were fraudulent?
The first suspicion came when I flew to Las Vegas to write the book. I got a contract to write it from Price, Stern and Sloan in LA. So I went to Vegas, where they have a large NASA library. And I picked up one of the books, and it told about a man named Thomas Ronald Barron.
So, as Jarrah highlights, Grant had suggested the book, probably more as a satirical piece, but then Bill says later that it went into being more serious after he'd learnt about the death of Thomas Barron, which Bill goes on to talk about.
Now, Barron was an inspector on Pad 34, where Grissom, Chafee, and White were burned to death. After this disaster, Barron was called before a congressional investigating committee and asked to tell about his experiences. Well, Barron told about all kinds of inept work, mismanagement, total incompetence, people being drunk on the job. In other words, he gave a revelation that Apollo wasn't going to work because of the failure of NASA and North American aviation. 4 days later, Thomas Ronald Barron was killed in an alleged automobile accident at a railway crossing near Titusville, Florida.
Now that seems to largely fit Jarrah's statement. As Bill highlights in the interview, he learnt about the Barron report whilst visiting a library in Florida after he'd got a publishing deal, which presumably means he'd already approached the publishers with the idea of writing the book that Grant suggested, and then began looking into Apollo. So it's quite possible that Bill started reading up on Apollo with the idea of writing a satirical book, then changed his mind and it became more a real investigation. Possibly through confirmation bias because he was looking for holes, or perhaps he didn't change his mind and instead he just put forward that story to sell the book. Though of course that is speculation. The only bit of Jarrah's explanation which to me doesn't completely align with Bill's statements, though, are where Jarrah says Bill, quote, harbored doubts about the program based on all the stuff he saw going on at Rocketdyne during his career. For the most part, he put said doubts out of his mind and didn't think twice about them, end quote. To me, that doesn't seem to quite fit Bill's words, because in the interview, Bill said prior to Grant's book suggestion in 1974, he believed they went to the moon.
And that's exactly where I got the idea, from John Grant in 1974 at the Oakland Marina. Prior to that time, I, like almost everybody else in the United States, believed that we went to the moon.
Now, for me personally, that doesn't seem to fit. Given a key foundation of Bill's claims that they never went to the moon was his time working at Rocketdyne and saying the technology didn't exist to get humans to the moon and back.
And of course, I was in on all of the top secrets about the development of Mercury and Gemini, and of course Atlas, and eventually Apollo. And my experience as a technical writer led me to believe that a lot of the things that the aerospace industry and NASA profess to have done were never done.
Even in the opening pages of his book, he writes, quote, "During the summer of 1969, I was living in a small house on the beach in Santa Barbara, California. A fanfare of newspaper stories heralded the launch of astronauts to the moon. Soon, I knew TV screens would flicker with barely discernible pictures of moonwalkers. But despite a 7-year stint at Rocketdyne, the firm that built the main propulsion units for Apollo, I could not work up the least bit of interest in the entire astrophysical circus. Not even to the extent of reading an article or watching the most exciting moments on the boob tube. Why, I wondered? Why, of all people, shouldn't I be captivated with the prospect of seeing the fruition of my work and the labours of thousands of others who had contributed to the Apollo voyage programs? Why indeed? I decided I did not believe that Armstrong, Collins and Aldrin or anyone else was going to the moon, and consequently I could not generate the least enthusiasm for watching a phony performance." End quote. Now that seems strange to me. In my mind, if he had doubts / was convinced that the technology didn't exist based on his time at Rocketdyne, then surely he would have questioned the moon landings before 1974. That's 2 years after the Apollo program finished and after there'd been 9 crewed missions flown to the moon. Now, it's worth noting that apparently there's 2 versions of his book. The original was 200 pages long, and then this version that I have, which is seemingly a cut-down version of 76 pages. It's certainly the case, as per Bill's own words, that the original idea of the book claiming the moon landings were faked was actually based on a made-up idea by John Grant and not from a genuine belief that it didn't happen. But according to Bill, when then researching for a satirical book, he came to genuinely believe that they were faked, which is a plausible explanation, and it is purely conjecture to argue against it, and people will have to form their own opinions on the matter. For me personally, his statements don't seem to line up with each other though. Much of his book references Rocketdyne and engine failures, which he knew about long before the moon landings, and yet by his own words, he completely accepted the moon landings until 5 years after the first one. But then in his book, he portrays that he never believed the moon landings even when they were actually happening, which is a complete contradiction. If we say that Bill never believed it, like his book portrays, then I can't think of any logical reason why he would then lay out in great detail during an interview that he believed in the moon landings until reading about Thomas Barron in 1974, and that he'd already decided to start writing a book by that point. Conversely, if we take it that he's being accurate during the interview and that he didn't doubt the moon landings until 1974, then not only is the opening statement of his book at best a massive exaggeration, but it brings into question all his talk about his time at Rocketdyne.
And my experience as a technical writer led me to believe that a lot of the things that the aerospace industry and NASA profess to have done were never done.
It seems strange to me that if he'd seen so much evidence whilst working at Rocketdyne that going to the moon was not going to be possible, then surely you'd never trust the moon landings from the moment they happened. Even if we go with what Jarrah says about Bill putting such doubts out of his mind and not paying attention to the whole program or watching any of it, those doubts might well be buried, but they wouldn't be gone. Surely those doubts would have resurfaced pretty quickly after Grant suggested writing a book about it. Bill clearly put some thought into it because he'd made a trip to Las Vegas specifically to begin researching the idea. But according to him, the trigger point for making him believe it wasn't his time at Rocketdyne, it was reading about Thomas Barron.
And Thomas Ronald Barron was the turning point for me in the investigation of Apollo. I believe that anybody who tells the truth and is killed, it's very likely that they were telling the truth.
It becomes even more muddied by the fact that Bart Sibrel, the guy who interviewed Bill, has been on podcasts claiming that during such interviews, Bill told him that during his time at Rocketdyne, he handled NASA documents which stated going to the moon was impossible.
Thinking it's the greatest thing. And then I'm 14 years old, and I see Bill Casey, a former Rocketdyne employee who worked for NASA for 6 years on the Apollo program with high security clearance, only second to von Braun, who says, look, I edited a memo from von Braun to the Pentagon warning them they are not going to make the goal. There's only a 1 in 10,000 chance they can go to the moon on the first attempt.
And what year was this?
That was back in 1966, I think.
Again, another contradiction. So either Bill did make that claim, which further solidifies the idea that he would never believe the moon landings rather than only question it several years later, or he didn't make that claim, and that is instead a fabrication by Bart to sound more convincing in a podcast, which if that's the case, then hoaxers, you should be calling Bart out on this because he's damaging the credibility of your arguments. And finally, one last thing that stands out to me is, as per Bill's interview, he first got the idea to write the book by Grant in 1974, though he doesn't specify when in 1974. And according to him at that point, he believed the moon landings until he travelled to Las Vegas and read about Thomas Barron. That was whilst he was researching the book as satirical. Towards the end of his book, he explains how he first submitted the manuscript in December 1974, but that it was rejected. I think that might be why the original 200-page version was later cut down to a shorter one. So, even assuming that Grant gave him the idea to write the book on New Year's Day 1974 and he travelled to Las Vegas immediately, that is best case scenario 12 months from starting to research the topic to writing and submitting a 200-page manuscript, though in reality it's likely a lot less than that. And it's fairly typical that a portion of your time is taken up with rereads and editing, and then subtracting off the time you've already spent writing the book as well. Makes me question how much time did Bill actually spend on the research before he fully committed to the idea it was faked? Because it doesn't seem like it could realistically be that long. Now granted, I'm not a writer, and so I don't know the process, and a quick search I did on how long do books take from research to publish gave times varying from anything to 6 months to a few years. So maybe, he could do it within 6 months. I think it would be somewhat different though if he'd gone into the book research already having formed the conclusion that it was faked based on previous experiences. Like if a hoaxer now were to write a book about the moon landings being faked, they'd be starting with the foundational idea that it was faked already. They'd just be researching deeper into some of the areas, or they'd be researching for additional points to include. Or for example, if Bill already thought the landings were faked and Grant's suggestion simply gave him the idea to put those concerns into a book. But in this instance, we're not talking about somebody writing a book about something they already believe in, about an established thing like the official narrative of going to the moon. We're talking about somebody who's needing to investigate through all of the documents, pick apart everything, then form a conclusion and start to draw up a book about that. I.e., if you're investigating something, for example, like the police do, you're supposed to go through all of the available material, then draw your conclusions, and then draw up reports on said conclusions. To me, this feels like Bill wouldn't have had enough time researching the entire Apollo program before he committed to the verdict that it was already faked, to then have a book fully drafted and submitted less than a year after starting it. More likely, he drew the conclusion very early in the research and then went finding material that suited that. Like if a police officer looked at only the first piece of evidence that they picked up and concluded, yeah, this person's definitely guilty, then they only focused on what evidence they could get to fit that guilty verdict. It would be like if I suddenly turned around in a few months and I published a book claiming the Earth was flat. Now, for me, to have such a radical change of opinion, research and write a book in such a short space of time, to many people that would seem suspicious, like I was either just joking or trying to make a profit. So perhaps the origins of the moon landing hoax are based on a lie, that Bill always believed in the moon landings but outwardly portrayed that they didn't in order to profit from selling the idea. Something which several flat earthers clearly do. Or perhaps the origins of the moon landing hoax are based more on confirmation bias. Perhaps Bill inadvertently convinced himself that there was a hoax because he'd gone into researching a satirical book, which means he was going in with the intention of looking for things that he could spin into saying was evidence that it was faked. But again, that is purely speculation. Hopefully, Jara, if you see this, you'll be satisfied I haven't taken Bill's words out of context, but if there's anything you feel I've missed or would like to clarify, I'd be happy to pin your comment down below. For me personally, there are several aspects of this official narrative which doesn't seem to add up, and a few areas of contradiction that makes me question it. Just like moon landing hoaxes are with NASA. So, that's going to be it for this video. As always, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video and you haven't already done so, then please do consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons, and hopefully, we'll see you in the next video.